Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture session on metal casting and welding process. I am Anil Kumar MM, working as Assistant Professor, Department of Mechanical Engineering, Maharaja Institute of Technology, Mysore. Okay, in the previous session we had discussed about different types of welding processes. Okay, in this session we are going to discuss the metallurgical aspects in the welding process. During the welding process, the large amount of heat will be involved. Okay, so when the two metals are welded, so resulting in there is a changes in the microstructure of the material. Okay, once the microstructure changes, the physical properties of the material also changes, as well as the material is subjected to heating and cooling. Hence, it is necessary to study the metallurgical aspects in the welding process, because during the welding process we are heating the edges of the two metal pieces. When the large amount of heat will be involved during the welding process, there is a changes in the microstructure of the material. Okay, if the microstructure of the material will be changes, means there is a resulting in there is a changes in the properties of that material. Okay, once the properties changes, so it is necessary to study the microstructural behavior of the workpiece material. Next we'll move on to the formation of different zones in the welding process. During welding process, the large amount of heat will be interacting with the workpiece material, so the material is subjected to changes in the microstructure. So during heating of the material, the flow of temperature will be varies from region to region, or from one place to another place on the surface of the workpiece material. Okay, for example, if you are heating the edges of the two metal pieces, so a high amount of heat will be involved at the edges. At that time, the temperature will be varies from this region to another region, so resulting in the three distinct regions are formed. That is, one is the fusion zone, heat affected zone, and base metal zone. Three distinct regions will be formed on the material. Okay, these three zones are identified depending upon the composition of the material or the temperature cycle during the welding process. Okay, so the three different zones are formed during the welding process are: one is the fusion zone, another one is the heat affected zone, and another one is the base metal zone. Okay, now let's discuss one by one. Okay, what is fusion zone? Fusion zone is nothing but it is the fusion zone is nothing but it is a base metal itself. Okay, here the molten metal of the electrode is combined with the molten metal of the workpiece material. That zone you can call it as the fusion zone. Fusion zone means it is the weld metal zone. Okay, or weld metal itself. Here the molten filler material is combined with the molten workpiece material and to form the weld bit. That zone you can call it as the fusion zone. Okay, it is similar to a casting structure. In the casting, the molten filler material is melted in a molten state, and then you go for solidification process upon cooling. So that structure you can call it as the fusion zone. Okay. In this fusion zone, the columnar grain structure will be formed. Okay, these column grain structures are relatively longer and parallel to the heat flow. Okay, that zone you can call it as the fusion zone. Next is heat affected zone. The zone adjacent to the fusion zone, and that zone we can call it as the heat affected zone, or the fusion zone is surrounded by the heat affected zone. Okay, in this zone the base metal will not melt, but it is subjected to heating at a elevated temperature for a brief period of time. Okay, this zone you can call it as the heat affected zone. The zone adjacent to the fusion zone, that zone you can call it as heat affected zone. Okay, in the heat affected zone, the workpiece material will not melted, but it will be subjected to heating at elevated temperature for a brief period of time. Okay, that zone you can call it as the heat affected zone. In the heat affected zone, it experiences the changes in the microstructure of the material. Okay, so this heat affected zone will experience there is a heating of the material. At that time, there is a changes in the microstructure of the material. Okay, in this zone, the porous grain structure will be formed, and this porous grain structure makes the base metal to be weaker. The material in the base heat affected zone, it will be weaker compared to the weld bead as well as the base metal zone. Okay, compared to these two, this area the material will become weaker because this area is subjected to heating. Okay, that will be elevated temperature for a brief period of time. Okay, here the workpiece will not melt, but it is subjected to heating. Due to heating of this material, there is a resulting changes in the microstructure of the material. Okay, in the heat affected zone, the porous grain structure will be formed. Okay, and next zone is the base metal zone. Base metal zone is nothing but, or it is also called as unaffected zone. Here the base metal will not melt, it is not subjected to heating. Okay, that zone you can call it as the base metal zone or unaffected zone. Okay, here the base metal will not melt, it is not subjected to heating, so it is unaffected. There is no changes in the microstructure in the base metal zone. Okay, during welding process, the large amount of heat will be interact with the workpiece material. Okay, so the large amount of heat will be interact with the workpiece material, so the flow of temperature is varies from region to region. Okay, or one place to another place, so resulting in the three distinct regions will be formed, that is fusion region, heat affected zone region, and then the base metal zone. Fusion region means that is a weld metal itself, that region you can call it as the fusion zone. In the fusion zone, the molten metal of the filler material is combined with the molten metal of the workpiece material, and it form the welding, or it form the weld bit. That zone you can call it as the fusion zone. Fusion zone, the porous grain structure will be formed, and these porous grains are relatively longer and parallel to the heat flow. Okay, and this zone is surrounded by the heat affected zone, or the adjacent to the fusion zone you can call it as the heat affected zone. Here the base metal will not melt, but it is subjected to heating at elevated temperature some brief period of time. Okay, here there is a, due to heat, so there is a changes in the microstructure. In the heat affected zone, the porous grain structure will be formed, and this area will be subjected to heating, so it will make the base metal will be weaker compared to the base metal and then the weld bead. Okay, next it is unaffected zone or base metal zone. Here the material will not subjected to heating, so it is unaffected, there is no changes in the microstructure. Okay, these three distinct regions will be formed during the welding process. Okay, so one is the fusion zone, heat affected zone, and then the base metal zone. Next is the structure of weld. So during the welding process, the large amount of heat will be involved, or we are heating the edges of the two metal pieces. Okay, upon solidifying, we will get the strong solid joint. So the microstructure development in the weld bead is depends upon the solidification behavior of the base metal. Okay, so the microstructure development in the welding, it is depends upon this the solidification behavior of the workpiece material. So the structure microstructure in the three zones are, one is the microstructure in the fusion zone, microstructure in the heat affected zone, and microstructure in the base metal zone. Microstructure in the fusion zone is nothing but it is a weld metal itself, where the molten filler metal is combined with the molten workpiece material in order to form the weld bead. That zone you can call it the fusion zone. In the fusion zone, the columnar grain structure will be formed on the base metal. Okay, the columnar grains will be formed on the base metal, and these columnar grains are relatively longer, and this will be parallel to the flow of the heat, or parallel to the heat flow. Okay, that is the microstructure formed in the base metal. Okay, in the fusion zone, the columnar grains will be formed in the base metal. Okay, next microstructure in the heat affected zone. In the zone adjacent to the fusion zone, you can call it as the heat affected zone. Heat affected zone is nothing but here the base metal will not melt, but this base metal is subjected to heating at elevated temperatures for some period of time. Okay, in this zone, the porous grain structure will be formed on the base metal. Okay, here the columnar grains will be formed, but in the heat affected zone, the porous grain structure will be formed on the workpiece material. Okay, due to heating of the material. Okay, this will be subjected to heating, so there is a changes in the microstructure. Okay, here the porous grain structure will be formed on the base metal. Okay, so this porous grains will be formed. This makes the material will be weaker compared to the fusion zone and then the base metal zone. Compared to these two zones, here the material become weaker because it is subjected to heating. Okay, and next is there is a microstructure in the base metal. Base metal is nothing but it is an unaffected zone, it is not subjected to heating, so there is no changes in the microstructure in the base metal. Okay, this is the structure of the welding. Okay, the three structure will be formed on the welding. One is the microstructure in the fusion zone, and microstructure in the heat affected zone, and microstructure in the base metal zone. In the microstructure in the fusion zone, the columnar grain structure will be formed, and these grains are parallel to heat flow and relatively long. And in the heat affected zone, the porous grain structure will be formed, and this makes the base metal become weaker compared to the base metal and then the weld bead. And then in the base metal zone, the metal will not subjected to heating. Okay, it is unaffected zone, so there is no changes in the microstructure. Okay. Next we will move on to the heat affected zone. We already have discussed the heat affected zone. During welding process, the large amount of heat will be involved, and then we are melting the edges of the two metal pieces, and upon cooling we will get the strong solidant. Okay, when the large amount of heat is interact with the workpiece material, the temperature will be changes from region to region. Okay, so the temperature will be changed from one region to the another region. At that time, the three distinct regions will be formed. One is fusion zone and heat affected zone, and then the base metal zone. So heat affected zone. Heat affected zone means the zone adjacent to the fusion zone. You can call it as the heat affected zone. In the heat affected zone, the base metal will not be melted, but the base metal will be subjected to the heating at the elevated temperature for a brief period of time. Okay, during welding process, that time the heat will be transferred into the edges of the two metal pieces. So the material is subjected to heating at elevated temperature for a brief period of time. At that time, when the heat the edge of the two metal pieces, there is a changes in the microstructure of the material. Okay, due to the heat. Okay, so in that heat affected zone, the porous grain structure will be formed. Okay, in the heat affected zone, the porous grain structure will be formed. Okay, this porous grain structure will make the base material will be weaker compared to the base metal and then the weld bead. Okay, compared to this region, the material will be weaker compared to the fusion zone and then the base metal zone. That is called as heat affected zone. Okay. Some of the factors will be affecting the heat affected zone. Those factors are: one is the heat input, thermal diffusivity, and then the welding speed. Okay, heat input. Okay, if the heat input on the workpiece surface will be very longer, so the heat affected zone will be increases. Okay, if the heat input is very high at that time, or the heat input will be increases, the heat affected zone is also increases. Okay, the high amount of heat will be involved on the surface of the workpiece material. At that time, the heat affected zone will be increases. Okay, some of the welding process like oxyacetylene welding process and atomic hydrogen welding process, the heat affected zone will be very high. Okay, and then the heat input will be very high. Okay, similarly, few of the welding process like laser beam welding and electron beam welding, it produces the concentrated heat sources and limited heat intensity that can be concentrated on the particular area, so that will decreases the heat affected zone, because the heat input the heat will be concentrated only in the particular spot, so we can be controlled that heat input, so the heat affected zone will be decreases. Okay, and coming to the arc welding process, that will be found between these two. Okay, by the individual process like tungsten inert gas welding and electro slag welding process. Okay, so heat input, that is the first factor. If the heat input increases, the heat affected zone will also increases. Okay, few of the welding process like oxyacetylene welding, atomic hydrogen welding, the heat input will be increases, so the heat affected zone is also increases. Okay, if the heat input is very longer, the heat affected zone is also increases. Few of the welding process like laser beam welding and electron beam welding, so it produces the concentrated heat. Okay, that can be concentrated on a particular spot, so the heat affected zone will be decreases because the heat input will be decreases. Okay, and few of the welding process like arc welding process, that will be falls between these two, like individual process like tungsten inert gas welding and then the electro slag welding process. Okay, next factor affecting the heat affected zone is thermal diffusivity. Thermal diffusivity plays the larger role in the heat affected zone. Okay, in the heat transfer analysis, the thermal diffusivity is nothing but it is the ratio of thermal conductivity to the volumetric heat capacity, that is called as thermal diffusivity. Okay, thermal diffusivity is nothing but it is the ratio of thermal conductivity to the volumetric heat capacity. It is nothing but how easily the heat would be flows into the material or out of the material, that is called as thermal diffusivity. Okay, so how easily the heat flow into the material or out of the material, that is called as thermal diffusivity. If the thermal diffusivity is very high, if the thermal diffusivity is very high, so the cooling rate will be very high and the heat affected zone will be smaller. Okay, so the thermal diffusivity is very high, okay, the cooling rate will be high. Okay, if heat easily transfers from the workpiece material, so the material get cool easily or at a faster rate, so the heat affected zone will be small. Okay, if the thermal diffusivity is very low, if the thermal diffusivity is low, the cooling rate will be very slow, so the heat affected zone will be increases. Okay, that is one of the factor will affecting the heat affected zone. Thermal diffusivity is nothing but how easily the heat will be flow inside the material or the outside the material. Okay, that is called as thermal diffusivity. If the thermal diffusivity is very high, so the cooling rate will be very high, so the heat affected zone will be small. If the thermal diffusivity is very low, the cooling rate will be low and the heat affected zone will be longer. Okay, that is one of the factor will affecting the heat affected zone. And next is the welding speed. If the welding speed is very slow, okay, if you are doing the welding is very slow, so the cooling rate will be slow, so the heat affected zone will be increases. Okay, these are the three factors will affects on the heat affected zone. One is the heat input. If the heat input is larger or increases, the heat affected zone will be increases. Okay, few of the welding process like oxide-acetylene welding, atomic hydrogen welding, the heat input will be very high, so heat affected zone will be larger. But few of the welding process like electron beam welding and laser beam welding, the heat input can be concentrated on a particular area, so it decreases the heat input, so it also reduces the heat affected zone. Okay, and next thermal diffusivity. If the thermal diffusivity is very high, so the cooling rate will be very high and heat affected zone will be very small. And thermal diffusivity will be low, the cooling rate will be low, but the heat affected zone will be larger. Next, welding speed. If the slower welding speed, it takes the more cooling time or it takes more time to cool the material, so the heat affected zone will be increased. Okay, these are the three factors will directly affect on the heat affected zone. Okay, next we will move on to the effect of carbon content on structure and properties of the steel material. Okay, all of you know the steel is the most widely used material for the welding process compared to the other material. Okay, steel is the most widely used material for the welding process compared to the other material like cast iron or copper or aluminum. Okay, so steel is nothing but it is an alloy of iron and carbon. Okay, steel, it is an alloy of iron and carbon. Okay, in the steel the amount of carbon content is ranging from around 0.5 to 1.5%. the carbon will be there in the steel material. Okay, steel is an alloy of iron and carbon, and few of the elements, alloying elements will be added to the steel, that is phosphorus, sulfur, manganese will be added to in order to increase the properties of the material. Okay, some of the alloying elements, the small amount of these alloying elements will be added to the steel in order to increase the properties of the material like hardenability, strength, weldability and castability. Okay, weldability and wear resistance, etc. These are the properties can be imparted by adding the alloying elements into the steel material. Okay, so but the carbon is the most important ingredient, but the carbon, it is the most important ingredient in the steel because it directly affects on the physical properties of the material. Okay, so you have to concentrate more on the carbon content in the steel while adding the into the iron material. Okay, so this is the alloy of iron and carbon, that is the steel, but carbon is the most important ingredient. We have to more concentrate by adding the carbon content into the steel. Okay, the carbon is ranging from 0.5 to 1.5% in the steel material, because this carbon content will directly affects on the physical properties of the material. Okay, in this steel, if the carbon content is very low, okay, in the steel the carbon content is very low, in order this will makes the steel become soft and ductile, so that material can be easily welded. Okay, if the carbon content is low or the carbon content will be low in the steel material, this will makes the material become soft and ductile, and that material can be easily welded. If the carbon content is very high, if the carbon content is very high, this will make the material become harder and stronger. Okay, and this will be less ductile, and that material can be easily welded. Okay, if the carbon content will low, the steel becomes softer and it is ductile, and that can be easily welded. If the carbon content will be high in the steel material, okay, more than 1.5% or so, this will make the material become harder and stronger. Okay, and it is less ductile, and that material is difficult to weld, and this carbon content in that material, it lowering the melting temperature of the steel material, and also this hardened steel have tendency to get crack during the welding process. Okay, because this carbon content will be high in the material, so that will makes tendency to get crack in during the welding process. Okay, to get the crack defects. Okay, and also and because the carbon content in the steel material, that will makes the lowering the melting temperature of the steel material. So we have to concentrate more on the carbon content. Okay, we had sufficiently, we had to the required amount of the carbon content in the steel to in order to get the required properties on the material. Okay, that is the effect of carbon content on the structure and properties of the steel. Okay, though steel is nothing but it is an alloy of iron and carbon is ranging from 0.5 to 1.5%, and the few of the alloying elements will be added into the steel that will impart the properties like strength, hardness, weldability, wear resistance, etc. Some of the alloying elements will be added into the steel is, that is phosphorus, sulfur, and then the manganese, but more constant we have to more concentrate on the carbon content, because it is directly affects on the physical properties of the steel material. If the carbon content will be very low, so it makes the steel become soft and ductile, and that can be easily welded. If the carbon content is very high, that will makes the material become stronger and harder. Okay, and it is less ductile, and that can be easily welded. Okay, and also the hardened steel have the tendency to get crack, okay, during the welding process, and because of the carbon content, it reduces the melting temperature of the steel. So hence the carbon content should be suitably varied or controlled in order to get the required properties in the steel material. Okay, next we will move on to the residual stresses. What do I mean by residual stresses, and what are the effects of the residual stresses, and how to control the residual stresses, and how to relieve the residual stresses. Okay, we will discuss one by one. What do I mean by residual stresses? Residual stresses is nothing but during welding the material expands due to heating, and upon cooling the material gets solidified and shrinks, so that it will exerts the stresses inside the material, or it will exerts the internal stresses or residual stresses inside the material. Or you can also say that upon cooling and heating of the material, the internal stresses will be developed inside the workpiece material. That internal stresses we can call it as the residual stresses. Okay, so upon heating of that material, the material get expanded, and upon cooling the material gets shrink. At that time, the internal stresses, some of the stresses will be developed inside the workpiece material. That stresses we can call it as the residual stresses. These residual stresses are these residual stresses remains in the body and they are independent of any applied load. Okay, residual stresses always present in the workpiece material and these are independent to the applied load, and these residual stresses it directly affects on the or influence the properties of the material. Okay, next what are the effects of residual stresses? Okay, if the residual stresses is developed in the workpiece material, it will affects like it will be residual stresses will be decreases the ductility of the joint or ductility in the workpiece material. Okay, it reduces the ductility of the material. Okay, and these residual stresses will reduces the strength of the material at the joint. Okay, it will be reduces the strength of the material at the joint. Okay, and these residual stresses increases the rate of damage. Okay, these residual stresses increase the rate of damage due to fatigue or some environmental degradation, and also it reduces the strength of the material and due to cold cracking and all, and it also causes the visible distortion of the component. Okay, these are the effects of the residual stresses. Residual stresses is nothing but some of the internal stresses will be developed upon heating and cooling of the workpiece material. Upon heating, the material get expanded, and upon cooling the material gets shrink. At that time some stresses will be induced inside the workpiece material, that is called as residual stresses, and it will be effects on the workpiece material, like it will be decreases the ductility of the material, and also it decreases the strength of the material, and it increases the rate of damage due to fatigue or some environmental degradation, and it also induces the visible distortion of the component. Okay, these are the effects of the residual stresses. Okay, next we will move on to how to control the development of the residual stresses in the workpiece material. So the residual stresses, to reduce the amount of heat input on the workpiece material, we can control the formation of the residual stresses. Okay, and to minimize the amount of weld deposited. Okay, so we can minimize the residual stresses. Okay, the amount of material deposited during the welding process, that can be minimized. Okay, if the amount of material deposited will be very less, so the residual stresses will be less. If the material deposited will be very large amount of metal will be deposited in the joint, at that time the large amount of stresses will be developed inside the workpiece material. So the amount of metal deposited, that can be minimized by reducing the by reducing the residual stresses. Next, we have to select the proper welding joint. Okay, compared to so we can select U grooves instead of V grooves. Okay, because it consumes less metal deposited in the welding area. Okay, so we have to select the proper welding joint. Okay, you can select U grooves instead of V grooves. Okay, it consumes less metal to fill the gap between the two metal pieces. Okay, next we have to select the proper electrode. Okay, we have to select the proper electrode. We can control the formation of the residual stresses, and segment of weld. Okay, instead of the continuous weld from one end to another end, we can select the segment welding. So we have to do the segment welding instead of the continuous weld from one end to other end. Okay, we can weld from one end to another end, that can be avoided. Okay, the sequence of welding, it does not from one end to other end. Instead of the sequence of welding, we can control the formation of the residual stresses in the workpiece material. Okay, one is we have to reduce the amount of heat input and to minimize the amount of material deposited into the joint, and we can select the proper welding joint, like instead of V grooves we can select the U grooves. Okay, and select proper electrode. Okay, proper electrode. Okay, and then I have to select the segment welding instead of the continuous welding. From the welding sequence does not from one end to other end. Instead of, we can use the segment welding. Okay, these are the steps you can select it to control the formation of the residual stresses inside the workpiece material. Okay, next we'll move on to relieving or removing the residual stresses. How to remove the residual stress? Already I told that residual stresses remains in the body. It is always there in the workpiece material because it is independent to the any applied load. So that can be relieved by the two processes. One is the peening and another one is the heat. Peening are nothing but it is hammering, just heating the weld metal with the help of the bolt round edge material. Okay, just we are hammering on the weld bit. At that time the material get expanded. Okay, get expanded and it makes thinner and thinner, so we can eliminate the residual stresses whatever present in the workpiece material. Okay, and this peening is suitable only for the ductile material. Okay, this peening operation or hammering operation is suitable only for the ductile material, and care should be taken while the hammering on the material. Okay, next is the heat treatment. Just we can heating the welding joint into elevated temperature and holding for from some period of time, and then we go for uniform cooling. At that time we can remove the residual stresses whatever present inside the material. Okay, just we are here cooling the material in a furnace from the required temperature to the atmospheric temperature. Okay, these are the two methods they are used to remove the residual stresses present in the workpiece material. One is the peening. Peening is nothing but just hammering. Okay, first we have to heat the material to the required temperature, and then with the help of the round bolt edge, just we have to hammering it. At that time the material get expanded and it become thinner and thinner, so we can remove the residual stresses whatever present inside the workpiece material. And this peening operation is possible only for the ductile material, and then care should be taken while hammering the workpiece material. Next is the heat treatment. Just you are heating the material to the required temperature and hold for some period of time, and then you go for the uniform cooling. At that time we can relieve the residual stresses from the workpiece material. Okay, so these are the two methods are used to remove the residual stresses present inside the workpiece material. Okay, residual stresses nothing but it is the some stresses will be formed inside the workpiece material upon cooling and heating of the workpiece material. Okay, during welding you can heat the edges of the two metal pieces. At that time the material get expanded, and upon cooling the material gets solidified. During solidification the material gets shrink. At that time some internal stresses will be developed inside the workpiece material. That internal stresses we can call it as the residual stresses. The formation of the residual stresses will affect or it decreases the ductility, and it reduces the strength of the material, and it increases the rate of damage and environmental degradation, and some visible distortion will be formed on the component. Okay, these are the effects of the formation of the residual stresses, and these residual stresses can be controlled by reducing the amount of heat input. Just we can concentrate the heat input on the particular area to reduce the formation of the heat affected zone, and heat input can be reduced, so we can control the formation of the residual stresses. And then to minimizing the amount of weld material is deposited in the welding area. So if the weld metal deposited will be very less, so less residual stresses will be formed. If metal deposit will be very high, so large residual stresses will be formed on the workpiece material. And we can select the proper welding joint, and then select proper electrode. Okay, and then the welding sequence, it should not be from one end to other end instead of the segment welding. Okay, and relieving or removal of residual stresses, one is the peening method is used, and another one is the heat treatment method. Peening method just is the hammering. Just you are hammering the welding area. At that time the material become expanded and it become thinner and thinner, so you can eliminate the residual stresses. Another one is the heat treatment. Just you are heating the metal into a required temperature and hold it for some period of time, and then we go for the uniform cooling. At that time we can eliminate the formation of the residual stresses inside the workpiece material. Okay, I hope all of you understood what we are discussing in today's class, like formation of the different zones in the welding. There are three distinct different zones will be formed on the welding process. One is the fusion zone, another one is the heat affected zone, and another one is the unaffected zone. Okay, and then structure of the weld. The three structure will be formed. One is the microstructure of fusion zone, microstructure of heat affected zone, and microstructure of unaffected zone. In the microstructure of fusion zone, the columnar grain structure will be formed. Okay, and these columnar grains are relatively longer and parallel to the heat flow. Okay, and then heat affected zone, the porous grain structure will be formed, and this porous grain structure, it makes the material become weaker compared to the base metal and then the weld bead. Okay, and then unaffected zone, there is no changes in the microstructure because it is unaffected, it is not subjected to heating. Okay, and next the structure of the weld, heat affected factor affecting the heat affected zone. There are three factors will affect the heat affected zone. zone. One is heat input, thermal diffusivity, and then the welding speed. If the heat input will be increases, the heat affected zone will be increases. Okay, and then thermal diffusivity. If the thermal diffusivity is very high, the cooling rate will be very high, so the heat affected zone is relatively small. If the thermal diffusivity is very low, the cooling rate will be very low, and then the heat affected zone will be increases. Okay, thermal diffusivity is nothing but how easily the heat will be flow inside the material or out of the workpiece material. Okay, and next the welding speed. If the slower welding speed, it takes more time to cool, so the cooling rate will be increases, so the heat affected zone will be very low. Okay, our heat affected zone will be increases. Okay, these are the factors will affect the heat affected zone. And next is this effect of carbon content. The carbon content is there in the steel is around 0.5 to 1.5%. If the lower carbon content is very low in the steel, so the material becomes soft and ductile, and that can be easily welded. If the carbon content is very high, it makes the material become harder and stronger, that is difficult to do welding, and it is less ductile. So we have suitably to control the carbon percentage in the steel, so to obtain the required properties. Okay, steel is nothing but it is an alloy of iron and carbon. Okay, and then other some alloying elements will be added into the steel in order to impart the strength, hardness, weldability, wear resistance, etc. Okay, few of the alloying elements added to the steels are, that is phosphorus, manganese, and then the sulfur. Okay, and next we move on to the residual stresses, effects of residual stresses, control of residual stresses, and then how to remove the residual stresses. Okay, thank you.